In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world still felt suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, the music community woke to the kind of news that sends a tremor through time. Steve Cropper, one of the most influential and understated guitarists in the history of American music, had passed away. For many listeners, his name had always lived like a signature at the bottom of a masterpiece, subtle, modest, but unmistakable to anyone who truly knew the art form. His passing didn't simply mark the end of a career. It felt like the soft extinguishing of a warm light that had quietly illuminated decades of soul, R&B, and rock history. Over the next few hours, tributes began to flow in from every corner of the world. But among them, two voices carried a weight that instantly drew the attention of millions: Eric Clapton and Keith Richards. For Clapton and Richards, Steve Cropper wasn't just another guitarist. They saw him as a teacher without ever formally stepping into a classroom. He was the kind of musician who didn't rely on flamboyance or technical spectacle to prove his worth. Instead, he built his legacy on feel, subtlety, and the power of restraint. To musicians like Clapton and Richards, men who themselves helped shape the architecture of modern guitar music, Cropper represented something rare and almost sacred. He embodied a philosophy that the guitar should serve the song, not the ego. His work wasn't about being the loudest or the fastest. It was about finding the perfect note, the perfect rhythm, the perfect heartbeat in every track he touched. When Eric Clapton spoke about Steve Cropper's death, his voice carried the weight of years of listening, learning, borrowing, and honoring. Clapton described how, in his early days, he would sit for hours studying Cropper's style. He recalled that Cropper's playing taught him more about musical honesty than any textbook ever could. Clapton explained that Cropper had a way of making even the smallest guitar line feel like a conversation, warm, human, and full of soul. He talked about the timeless tracks Cropper shaped during his years with Booker T and the MG, especially the iconic sound of Green Onions, a song that etched itself into music history like a fingerprint. Clapton said that Cropper taught him the power of leaving space, of knowing when not to play something Clapton believes defines true mastery. As Clapton recounted memories, fans were struck by how deeply personal the tribute felt. This wasn't a distant acknowledgement from one legend to another. It was intimate, almost fragile, like the unearthing of a long-guarded truth. Clapton said that Cropper's music was woven into his own musical DNA. When he struggled, he listened to Cropper. When he composed, he asked himself what Cropper would do. When he felt lost, he found grounding in the kind of groove and simplicity that Cropper perfected. Clapton admitted that even after decades in the spotlight, there were still moments when he felt humbled by Cropper's touch. By the way, he could say so much with so little. Keith Richards, ever the soulful observer of music's raw edges, delivered a tribute that felt equally emotional but deeply characteristic of his own voice. Richards had always been a student of rhythm, feel, and authenticity, and in Steve Cropper he saw a kindred spirit. Richards said that Cropper wasn't just a guitarist, he was a groove machine, a craftsman who built songs from the inside out, starting with the heartbeat rather than the spotlight. The Rolling Stones guitarist described how Cropper's riffs had influenced some of his own early explorations into soul-driven rock. Richards admitted that when he first heard Booker T and the MG, it felt like stumbling into a hidden room in the mansion of American music, a place where everything was laid back, honest, and irresistibly cool. Richards spoke with a quiet sincerity. Recalling the day he finally met Cropper in person, he described it as meeting the man behind the curtain, someone whose modest personality sharply contrasted with the monumental influence he wielded. Richards laughed, remembering how Cropper had once scolded him, gently but firmly, for overplaying during a jam. "Let it breathe," Keith Cropper had said, and Richards admitted that those 3 words stayed with him for the rest of his career. Hearing this story brought fans to tears, not only because it came from a man rarely seen, so emotionally open, but because it perfectly captured the essence of who Steve Cropper was: a gentle guide, a quiet master, a musician who believed that the soul of the song mattered far more than the shine of the player. Both Clapton and Richards emphasized how unusual it was to find a guitarist whose style transcended genre, generation, and geography. Cropper had worked with some of the greatest musicians of all time, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Sam and Devon, yet he never positioned himself at the center of attention. He preferred the shadows, content to let the music take the spotlight. This humility, Clapton said, made Cropper even more remarkable. Richards added that Cropper's creativity shaped the sound of Stax Records, and through it, influenced every major branch of American soul and rhythm and blues. His guitar lines became the blueprint of a genre. As fans absorbed these tributes, many found themselves reflecting, not just on Cropper's music, but on the emotional candor shown by Clapton and Richards. In their voices, there was a shared grief that felt surprisingly universal. They spoke not only for themselves, but for countless musicians who had been touched by Cropper's work, sometimes without even realizing it. And in their words, there was a deep sense of gratitude for the grooves, the riffs, the simple lines that carried the weight of entire stories. Gratitude for a man whose quiet brilliance shaped generations. As the world continued responding to the news of Steve Cropper's passing, the story unfolded not only as the departure of a musician, but as the fading of an era built on authenticity, groove, and emotional truth. Across social media and music forums, fans began rediscovering the simple brilliance hidden in Cropper's recordings. They replayed the timeless riffs, the subtle accents, the warm and confident rhythm that defined his signature. And as people revisited his legacy, the emotional weight of Eric Clapton and Keith Richards' tributes began to make even more sense. These tributes were not just expressions of grief. They were acknowledgments of a man who had quietly shaped the identity of modern guitar music. In the days following Cropper's death, Clapton's words became a reference point for the entire global guitar community. Musicians, young and old, spoke about how Clapton's emotional tribute pushed them to revisit Cropper's work with a deeper sense of respect. Clapton had described Steve as the architect of feel, a phrase that immediately went viral among fans. For Clapton, Cropper's brilliance wasn't found in complicated solos or lightning-fast runs. It was in the intention behind every note, in the warmth that radiated through each chord, and in the deep understanding of how music should breathe. Clapton explained that Cropper understood the guitar not as a weapon, but as a language, a subtle, expressive form of storytelling. Clapton also reflected on how Cropper had influenced some of his most personal musical decisions. He revealed that during the recording of certain emotional tracks, he would listen to Cropper's playing to remind himself to stay honest and grounded. Clapton said that Cropper taught him that a single clean note, placed with meaning, could strike deeper than 100 blazing scales. As Clapton spoke about this, fans felt that they were hearing a side of him rarely revealed, a side shaped by humility, reflection, and a student-like admiration for a man whose name wasn't always in the spotlight. Keith Richards, meanwhile, offered a tribute that resonated just as powerfully, but in a different emotional tone. Richards had always admired the way Cropper approached rhythm guitar as if it were the spine of a song. To Richards, the groove was everything, the pulse, the heartbeat, and in Cropper, he found someone who lived by the same musical philosophy. Richards said that Cropper didn't just play rhythm, he defined it. He described Cropper's style as deceptively simple and incredibly deep, built on instinct rather than calculation. What moved fans most was the sincerity in Richards' voice when he recalled the first time he jammed with Cropper. He said it felt like sitting beside a river that had been flowing long before he arrived, a river he instinctively wanted to follow. Richards laughed softly as he admitted that Cropper taught him more in 10 minutes of jamming than he had learned in years of touring. But it was a particular moment, Richards recalled, when Cropper told him, "Keith, give the music space," that struck a chord worldwide. This brief piece of advice encapsulated Cropper's entire philosophy. Music isn't about filling the silence, it's about honoring it. As fans watched these tributes, many began to realize that Cropper's presence in music history had always been almost mythic. He shaped the sound of Stax Records, co-wrote soul classics, defined the guitar language of an entire era, and yet remained a humble craftsman who preferred staying behind the curtain. This humility, Clapton and Richards emphasized, was part of what made him extraordinary. He didn't chase fame, he chased feel. He didn't chase recognition, he chased resonance. And because of that, his music stood the test of time. The video tribute also explored how Cropper influenced countless artists beyond just Clapton and Richards. Bassists, drummers, and vocalists all spoke about how Cropper had an uncanny ability to support a song without ever overshadowing it. He built musical arrangements like an architect builds a home, sturdy, balanced, and welcoming. His guitar lines were never distractions. They were foundations, and musicians around the world echoed the sentiment that without Steve Cropper, the blueprint of soul and R&B might have been very different. In revisiting Cropper's collaborations, fans rediscovered moments that had shaped music history. They revisited the emotional power of Otis Redding's recordings, many of which bore Cropper's unmistakable fingerprints. They rediscovered the raw energy of Wilson Pickett, the groove of Sam and Dave, and the soulful ambience of Booker T and the MGs. Every revisit felt like opening an old photograph, familiar, comforting, but suddenly more meaningful in the context of loss. Clapton and Richards, in their tributes, emphasized that Cropper's passing wasn't the loss of a man alone, but the loss of a certain kind of artistry, the kind rooted in honesty, restraint, and emotional intelligence. They said that in a world where music often chases volume, speed, and spectacle, Cropper was a reminder of what truly matters: connection. His playing wasn't about impressing, it was about touching the heart. The video explored how fans reacted to these tributes. Many were surprised to hear Clapton and Richards speak with such vulnerability. These were men who had lived through decades of rock and roll chaos, personal struggles, and the evolution of music itself. They had outlived many peers, seen the rise and fall of eras, and yet, here they were, visibly shaken by the loss of one man whose soft-spoken wisdom had shaped them both. It was this vulnerability that left viewers speechless. Seeing such legends grieve for a musician who rarely took center stage revealed just how deeply respected Steve Cropper truly was. As the tribute video moved into its final segment, the tone shifted from reflection to legacy, a deeper exploration of how Steve Cropper's presence would continue echoing through time. It wasn't simply about remembering a musician's past, it was about acknowledging the future he quietly shaped for generations to come. The narrator emphasized that the true measure of Cropper's greatness wasn't in awards or flashy headlines, but in how deeply he became embedded in the musical language that artists still draw from today. Eric Clapton's tribute returned in this section, revealing a more contemplative side of his relationship with Cropper's work. Clapton said that one of the reasons Cropper's music would never fade is because he understood something timeless: the emotional purpose of music. Clapton explained that there are two kinds of guitarists: those who play to be heard and those who play to make others feel. Steve Cropper belonged to the second category, and Clapton believed that this made him immortal in ways fame never could. Clapton then admitted something few fans had heard before: that some of his most emotional recordings were directly inspired by Cropper's approach. Keith Richards echoed this sentiment, speaking about how Cropper's passing reminded him of the fragility of the musical lineage they all share. Richards said that each generation has its giants: those who teach, those who break ground, those who create the foundation upon which others stand. And for Richards, Cropper was one of those giants. Richards believed that without Cropper, the evolution of guitar-driven soul and rock would have taken a different path, perhaps more chaotic, less grounded, and lacking the quiet sophistication that became its identity. One of the most striking moments in the video was when Richards recounted a late-night memory of listening to Steve Cropper while sitting alone in a dimly lit studio. He said that as Cropper's smooth, rhythmic guitar filled the room, he realized that music could be both simple and life-changing at the same time. Richards described that moment as a turning point, a moment that influenced how he approached songwriting forever. Hearing this from a legend like Richards helped younger fans understand just how far-reaching Cropper's influence was. The video also delved into the way modern musicians have unknowingly inherited Cropper's musical principles. Producers today still chase the Cropper feel: clean, tight, soulful guitar parts that sit perfectly in the mix. Young guitarists studying soul and R&B still trace their favorite licks back to him. Even in film and television, Cropper's sound remains one of the most recognizable indicators of nostalgia, groove, and emotional warmth. His music has become a shorthand for authenticity. The tribute emphasized that while many artists chase the spotlight, Steve Cropper's brilliance came from doing the opposite. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, he never demanded attention. Instead, he let the music speak for him, and in doing so, he created a legacy stronger than many who lived their lives in the center of the stage. Clapton and Richards both mentioned that this humility is something today's world desperately needs, especially in an era where musicians often feel pressured to constantly perform, compete, and seek validation. The video concluded by bringing Clapton's and Richards' tributes together in a final emotional reflection. Both men expressed that losing Steve Cropper felt like losing a piece of music's soul, a quiet, steady force that held the history of an entire genre together. They spoke with gratitude more than sorrow, thankful that they lived in a world where they could learn from him, be inspired by him, and carry his philosophy forward. As the final scenes unfolded, the narrator explained that legends do not always roar. Sometimes they whisper, and Steve Cropper was one of those quiet legends shaping hearts, shaping songs, shaping history with a grace that few could ever match. The emotional reactions of Clapton and Richards reminded the world that greatness isn't measured by volume or fame, but by the depth of one's impact. Cropper's music will live as long as guitars are played, as long as soul music exists, and as long as artists seek honesty over spectacle.